Hello, good evening. Thanks to everybody for joining us. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty. It wouldn't be a Master Gardener meeting hosted by me if we didn't have some technical difficulties. So give us a few more minutes while everybody joins us, and we'll get going here in just a couple minutes. All right. Jane, are you there with us?
Is that better?
Yeah, there you are. Great.
That might be important.
Yes, it is. All right. Well, Jane, are you ready for all this?
I am ready.
Okay. Well, whenever you are ready, I'll turn my video off and we'll just let you get going. Thanks for being here tonight, everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We'll get it all sorted out, but Jane's ready to go. I'm excited to hear about shade gardening. I've got a big old bur oak in my yard, Jane, that is needing some love underneath it. So I'm ready to hear what you have to say. I know lots of folks around here call me because their grass is dying, and usually it's because of shade. So any advice you have for us will be really helpful as we look at good ways to do gardening underneath our shade trees. So, all right, Jane, with that, I'll get out of your way and let you go.
Okay, let's get started. First of all, I want to talk about just a little background. On my road to shade gardening, it all started when 5 trees, big shade trees in the front yard started to grow. And my grass became thin. The roots were exposed and you would hit them when you were mowing what little grass there was. And so I started making changes. And so I went and bought some shrubs. I bought some oak leaf hydrangeas and I bought some mahonias because I thought they both looked really neat. And my oak leaf hydrangeas died and my mahonias froze. So I thought, okay, what do I do? So next I decided to go with perennials because I didn't want to do boxwoods and things like that. So as I share my journey with you, I hope that you find something that you can benefit from and you can learn from it, because to me, gardening's a learning experience. When I first get started, on my next slide, here's what my yard looked like after I'd worked on it for a while. And one of the things that we have to do is assess what we have. And you can see my trees. I've got a bur oak and 4 live oaks in the front yard, or 3 live oaks and a red oak in the front yard. So any one of those would be plenty of shade, and I've got all of them. And so my house faces the east, so I have some sun until about 10:30 in the morning on that, what you see right there. And then about 11 o'clock, all that turns into shade. And as the sun moves over the horizon. On the left side, you can't really see it now, but the way my yard slopes from the house, it slopes down into the street. So one of the problems I was having was when it rained, all my rainwater left my property because it all ran off. And it really ran so fast, it didn't have time to soak into my yard. And so my hail strip out front was all nut grass. And so that was another issue for me. And one of the things I did on my own is the rose bush I planted. It was a knockout rose. And as things do, they grow. And because I had neighborhood kids and stuff, I ended up taking that out. And I planted a lantana in there because I didn't want the kids to fall into the rose bush. So those are just things that I'm working with whenever I first started my yard. Well, first of all, we have to understand our shade, and shade is different for everybody where you live, and so you have to do your own evaluation. You want fewer than 4 hours of full sun, preferably in the cooler part of the day. You've got to watch your shade as it shifts from taller trees, but even as the sun goes over the horizon, it moves where your shade is on your property. And so, or your garden area or whatever, you need to have some partial or mottled shade all day long. I call it filtered shade. You need some of that. And you want to observe changes during the day. So how your yard looks at 8 o'clock in the morning isn't how it's going to look at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so just be aware of that and keep record of that so you can note where you want to plant something, what the sun looks like. One of the things are trees. Where does your shade come from? And most people, it comes from trees, fences, or buildings. And you can work with all of these. One of the problem areas that you have to be aware of is that shade that's so dense that you can't see sun at any time. And another thing, that when shade's created by shadow of buildings or fences sometimes, in addition to the shade, you have problems with airflow. And one of the things that healthy plants need is good air circulation. So you want to be able to have it where the air can blow by and circulate around your plants. You have to watch for wet and heavily rooted areas too. Another thing I forgot to mention earlier is trees. When you have your trees pruned, that totally affects your shade again, and you have to readjust things. So just be aware that a plant may be shaded now, but if you can have the arborists come in and they prune your trees, how that will change things. One of the things, because our trees are so important to us, is respect the tree roots. And I'm real careful with mine because I don't want to damage my tree roots, but you have to avoid severing any that are 2 fingers or diameter and larger. And I don't even cut them if they're 1 finger. I'm real particular on my roots. Then you can kind of read this with a gardening fork and loose soil. One of the things I want to say, if you bring in soil, and be careful where you get it, you want a good quality topsoil and you want good quality mulch. And you've got to be careful that you don't apply it too deep because you don't want to suffocate your roots. And one thing I do is I'll put some compost and soil down, and then the Texas heat, I call it, eats it up, or it uses it. So then I'm out about 3 times a year replenishing the compost to my garden beds so that they stay looking good. And then I add fertilizer at that time too. If you're going to cover a large part of your area underneath your trees, be careful that it says don't apply more than 2 inches of soil. I do my soil, and then I add part of my soil that I use. I also use compost, and then I put a mulch on top of that. So there's ways that you can work out that 2 inches so you don't exceed it. I want to repeat again, always use a good quality soil. It needs to be free of pieces of bark and twigs, because if you have big pieces of material in your what they call your soil, it will take the nitrogen out of the soil. That means that the nitrogen that's in the soil will focus on decomposing the barks and twigs and competing with your plants. So your plants won't get the nitrogen that you think they are getting. You're also going to be adding fertilizers, mulch, and preparation for seasonal changes. Whatever you do to your gardening bed, realize that you're also doing it to your tree, and be careful with that. Earlier, I talked about drainage and how you design and evaluate your site. You got to be careful of runoff and pools if you have an area that accumulates water on your yard. I know where we live, Williamson County has all kinds of terrain here. I live off of the hill country, so mine's a little bit different than some other people's. And I have more rocks and that sort of thing. But there are people that have some actual clay and soil in their yard. So you have to evaluate what you have. Another thing you need to know as far as shade goes, you've got to know where north is. You've got to know where your sun comes from and how the sun's going to move across your house. On wind patterns, that's important because, one, you may want to plant a plant that is willowy. And so you want the wind to be able to move that plant and to get the full benefit of that plant to accent your planting site or whatever your landscape design. Another thing with wind patterns, if you have a plant that, say, is sensitive to cold weather or that sort of issue that it might have, that you don't want to plant it where there's a strong wind from the north or that's going to come across there and make it colder in the winter time. So be aware of your wind patterns and where you want to plant your trees or plant your plants. Geology and soils, I've already briefly touched on that. You need to know what you have to know how to amend it. One of the things that you want to do when you create your design is on the use of patterns that can do a repeating effect, where if you use patterns, it provides rhythm to your yard or rhythm to your design. The most important thing to do when you're designing your property is to kind of draw out where things are, where your house is, where your sidewalks are, where your trees are that you're not going to move, all those things that are going to maintain and be stable, and then plan your design around them. Remember, before I go to the next page, I want to go back, when you add soil, you got to make sure that on your trees, when you're applying soil around to the base of the tree, and I'll show an example of this a little bit later, that your root flare, you want to leave it exposed. And I just want to touch that, but I'll hit it again before we're done with tonight. Once you consider you have everything sketched out, and one of the things I want you to consider as you plan your design is how you're going to use the new bed that you've got or the new shade garden you've got, and what's going to be its function. And so one of the things I think you need to take into account is all the people in the household. Like, you may have one idea, but if you have to plan for children or something else, maybe there's an elderly person that can't get around very well and has to have a smooth area. I don't know what your situation is, but think about all those issues that come up that you want to put and consider when you're making your plan. Another thing that we have to think about is our budget. Okay, most of us have a budget of some sort, or we think we can use so much, but it's surprising how much all this compost and plants cost. So one of the things you might want to think about after you do your design is that you can do this in sections. Like, take a certain section that you want to start with and do that, and then once you get that done, then move on to another section. Another reason that's important is because you want your yard to look nice, and if you tear up the whole thing, it may take you longer to get it put back together than what you think it will. And that way you've only got a spot that's tore up, and you can get that looking nice and move on to the next area. And that also works with your budget sometimes. It also goes along with appearance, because we want it to look nice. You need to think about the maintenance requirements that your design is going to cost you in time, or maybe you're going to hire someone to do it. But think about how much time it's going to cost to maintain the property or your garden once you get it designed. Another thing to think about is your water requirements. And depending on how far you are from a water source, or if you're going to use irrigation, think about that whenever you put your design in and where you put your plants. I've also got wildlife down there. I don't have deer. I live in a subdivision and never seen any deer. I've been there almost 20 years, but I do have other things that I want to encourage to come to my yard, like butterflies and birds and that sort of thing. There's squirrels, of course, in the area. So think about that if you want to plant plants to bring those into your yard or to keep them out. If you have food, they usually come. This picture I wanted to share with you. I've taken different garden tours, and this is off of one of my garden tours that I took. And when you look at this picture and you think of shade gardening, you're not going to see a big array of bright colors. Okay, you're going to see some, but you're not going to see a lot. So when you think about shade gardening and you look at this particular picture, you can see the different kinds of ferns they've planted. They've got some grasses going in there, some sedges and things like that. They've also got some bigger plants and ferns in the background, and you can see growing back there. But they've also added a water feature. I'm assuming this isn't natural there. They've put this in. But why would you use this area? Think about it. And to me, it would be relaxing. If there's a patio and a sitting area out across from this water feature, and I can think about sitting out there and having my breakfast, my morning coffee or whatever, or just enjoying the afternoon. And with all of these colors and the green and the shade it brings in, to me, it would be cooler sitting there than it would be maybe someplace else in the hot part of the summer. So think about how you would like to use your area. Let's go on to design a little bit more. I consider my shade garden is in my front yard. So to me, it's a welcome mat. The people first see my front yard before they see me or they see the house. So how's it look to them? What are you saying to them, or what are you saying to yourself? And one of the things that you have to be careful is if you live in an HOA, you have to check the HOA guidelines. They do come around, okay? And so be aware of that and of what they are. And remember, I'm hitting this again, but you've got to check your existing features and your trees, your walkways. Some of your walkways may move. You can change those, but chances are you aren't going to move your big trees. You can have a gardening theme. And this theme can be an extension of how you've decorated the inside of your home, because to me, these shade gardens are living spaces, and they make a living space just outside in the good weather. And so how do you want to decorate it? It can reflect the personality of interest of the owner, or another thing it can do, if you have a collection, you can put some of that out there. I have a brother that lives in Florida, and so he's accented his outside with like seagulls and different things he has from the ocean theme. So it's just whatever that you want to do, because it's your yard. And so feel free to do that. One of the things I wanted to mention on my function that I want to talk about is I have granddaughters. They were smaller. Of course, they're big now, but I took English paving stones and we painted numbers on them, and we made a hopscotch across my lawn to go from one area to the other. And then I had a small bird bath like thing there that I put stones in, and they could pick out a colored stone or colored piece of glass and use it to mark which spot they were stepping on. So there's different things like that that you can think about and that you can incorporate into your area, depending on if it fits your particular function for what you need. If you have children, just think about that. I want you to choose plants that draw attention to a certain focal point. Okay, now a lot of things, like in the front yard, it's going to draw you up to the front door. And if you look at this picture, they took, I call it artwork, but they took the artwork and put it on the ground where they used stones to define the area and to define the design. And so as you start from the sidewalk out by where the cars are, this path gets a little wider and it goes all the way up to the front door. And then as you get to the front door, there were more swirls with the darker rock and the lighter rock. And then they also had more plants. And to me, just think how this would move the traffic, okay? They could, as a person walks up the path, they could see what's going on with the plants and stuff, but the path still moving the people to a desired location for their front door. You will also need, whenever you use plants, to balance out a feature. You don't want one side real heavy and the other side real light. You need to have a mix of how you can accent the architectural style of your home. Okay, we've pretty well talked about all of this in the previous slide. Okay, here's another slide, and think about this function. Where I took the picture from, there was a fire pit up there and more seating area. So as you looked out in the yard, you could see this kind of like oasis of green in the middle, and they made sidewalk around it with decomposed granite. And one thing I've noticed too is people don't always use the same medium to do all their sidewalks or all their walk space. So feel free to mix them. They probably should be complementary, but the way this flows through there. And if you notice, this crushed granite path goes all the way around, and then it angles over and goes around some more of the yard to another way. So it's got movement. And also to the left, if you look straight back at the picture, there's a gate there where they can have access to a walking trail for that subdivision. So this is just one way to use the yard, use a space, and to think about. I wanted to give you examples. Okay, on choosing plants. I said earlier that few will provide blooms, and just be aware of that. You want to look for foliage texture, foliage color, and variation. And so that makes a big difference in how the plants look. If you remember how the picture I showed you earlier looked with the water feature and the different kinds of ferns and things, that was using, it's basically all green, but how it changed, and you could see the different areas pop out. You can accent a feature in pots or with artwork, or like that one example where they did some stuff on the ground. Just feel free, there's all sorts of ways. And don't feel bad about going somewhere and seeing something and borrowing that idea. I think it's all good. And with ground covers, you want to keep ground covers to something that's very easy to maintain. Another thing, when you pick a ground cover, decide if you need to walk over that area or not. If that area is going to be walked on, you're going to have a different kind of ground cover than if it was not going to be walked on. And we can talk about that a little bit more in choosing plants. Here, when you see these plants, I took this up at McKinney, Texas, and it was a historical area, but I wanted you to see, I put this in here for you to see how they use caladiums to kind of line the sidewalk, and see how the repeating pattern makes rhythm and makes it flow. And they've got some Turks Cap and other plants in there, but the main plant that they've got planted there is the caladiums. And then also on the walkway, it's not all perfect with the flagstones, the way they've put them, and the decomposed granite. It works. It moves the people from one area to the other. And I just want for you to see this as an example. Also, if you notice the caladiums, because they are have the white and the lighter green and the red to them, they brighten a darker area. So if you have an area that you want to that looks dark, that you want to brighten, add some plants that have light colored leaves or some interest to the leaves. Even a variegated or something like that would help to work on that. And again, I want to mention that if you want to plant a plant that's willowy, put it where the wind's going to move the leaves and the branches so that you will get the benefit of that plant in your design. Another thing is to think about the branching or the arching characteristics of the plant. Some plants droop or branch over, others are upright. So you want to do a combination of those two things whenever you plant something, so that you've got more interest in your yard than just green. You want to have a design. I'm hitting this again, but to keep your yard looking nice, you want to have parts of it easy to maintain. That's not going to take a lot of work on your part. And don't forget how big plants can get. When you do your research and you think, okay, I want a caladium or I want whatever, then look and see how big that plant's going to get and plan for that in your landscape design. The better the plant is adapted to the area, the more successful that plant's going to be whenever you get it in the ground. And to me, that's important, because I don't like to keep replacing things because they're not growing or they're not doing well. I like for what I put in there to work and me to move on to something else. Now I'm going to show you some of my plants. And I want to say this, because I live in Cedar Park, and the area that I live in Cedar Park, they told me that it was where a sawmill was whenever they did the cedar chompers came in and they had chomped all the cedar. And so I have a lot of rock. And when I say a lot of rock, I mean a lot of rock. I can't take a shovel and push it down in my ground at all. Okay, like a shovel that you'd step on with your foot, forget it. It's totally out. I can probably go down 2 inches, maybe 3 inches if I'm really lucky. And so I've had to amend my soil with that. And because of that, that affects what plants I can plant in my area. So if you live over in Georgetown or another part of Williamson County where you can actually take a shovel out and dig in your yard, you can amend your clay that you have with compost. Now I use a lot of compost too, but you can use your compost and help amend that soil to where you get it so it drains well for what you need. This particular area here that I'm showing you a picture of is in front of my house as you walk up past this going to my front door. I've had some failure with this area because when I first got it and we tore out the big shrubs that you couldn't see the windows from, I planted Gardenia. And for whatever reason, I don't think it got enough sun. Anyhow, it didn't do well. So after a period of time, I took that out and then I planted bicolor irises. I thought, well, they're hardy, I'll put those in here. But evidently, it didn't get enough sun because they never bloomed. And this area gets sun from about 11:30 to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then it gets the direct hot sun. So I have to have something here that can take the heat. And the flax lilies or the bicolor iris didn't work. So then I went to Turks Cap. I thought, okay, Turks Cap's hardy. It can take some sun, some shade. And I put it in here. And it always looks scraggly. It never looked like I wanted it to look. So as going around, I saw how people were using flax lilies. And so I decided, oh, okay, I'm going to try that one. And these have been in there a couple years. I guess this is their second year for them. And I'm real happy with the way they look. And the flax lily has a small flower on it. You can see the flower spike going up off of the right one. See if I can highlight it here for you. And but it has a small blue flower on it, but really the flower's insignificant. You're not planting it for the flower. You're planting it for the variegated foliage. There is a flax lily that does not have variegated foliage that's invasive. So be careful whenever you get your plants that if what you're planting to know if they're invasive or not. Do research on your plants before you get them. In this particular area here, I've got Gebera Daisy spaced out. And then between each Gebera Daisy plant, I planted 5 Delft blue hyacinths. So in the spring, those come up and they get taller than what the daisies are about. They're about 10 inches tall with the blossoms on, and they're very fragrant. And so that's just a way that I've blended the different flowers and I get a pop of color. And then every once in a while, one of my daisies will bloom and I'll get a pop of color from that. So that works for me. Another thing that I like to use are bearded irises. And the bearded irises over here on the left is quite large. When I took this picture, it was almost the size of a dinner plate, and I'd never had one come up that large before. But I had trimmed some shade out or trimmed some bushes out, and it got more sun, and it just blossomed this year. And so it's a very beautiful, to me, it's a very beautiful iris. On the right, I've got a batik iris. They're much smaller, but they still provide a pop of color. And even though irises bloom at irregular times and different times, when they do bloom, they can do a pop of color. And an iris can take some shade. So if it's got half a day shade, it will do fine for you. And when you think about the plants that want shade or want some sun, whenever you think about how the sun moves across your property, you might be able to find different pockets of sunlight in your landscape that will tolerate more plants with more sun. Here's another one. I use reblooming irises a lot too. I like those. And this one bloomed like in May. And then I went out and the day New Year's Eve, this was blooming on the left side. And I thought, oh, wow, what a pleasant surprise, and a pop of color and things like that make me smile. And so the next day or that night it frosted, so you can see what it looked like the next day. But for a day, it looked really pretty, and I enjoyed watching it. I thought thought about cutting it down, and I thought, no, I'm just going to leave it and see what it does. Here's a sun and sand iris. This one doesn't get quite so tall, and it's out by the front walk, and it's in my health strip. And so what I want you to know is I have the gold colors throughout my health strip, gold, orange, and red. And so I think this one works well out there. Here, over here to this side, if you see where that stone is, and going to the left, that's my neighbor's property, and he has constant nut grass. So you can see it in the crack. So I fight it all the time. Here I see a piece that's came up. So every week or two I go out and dig out the nut grass that's coming over from my neighbor's yard. It's just something I deal with. We all have favorite things that we got, and this is a plant of a lily that I got when one of our favorite uncles passed away, and I got this from his funeral. And I keep this with me, and I've moved it like 4 or 5 times, but to different houses, different locations, but here it is blooming again. And so if you have favorite things that you can incorporate into your yard, remember it's your yard and you want to make it meaningful to you. So feel free to add whatever that you want like that. So this is like an accent plant. I don't have like 20 of these, I only have 1 or 2. And so just make sure that that's how it can benefit for you. Here's my Staghorn Fern, and this is a picture of it that I took right before, I think it was in February, when we cut this thing up. And this is the 3rd time I've cut it up. As you see, it can get quite large, and it's in a gorilla wheelbarrow. And I think I got 35, 40 stalks off of it that I could cut out of the basket, and some I couldn't even cut out by the way they were entwined around the metal basket. But this plant likes shade, and so it likes to be sprayed with water and kept moist, and it will not take the cold, though. You have to take it in. So I never let my plant get colder than 45 degrees or I bring it in. So, but this is a fern that will take the shade, and there's several ferns that will take the shade. Here's another plant I have in my front yard. This is a Lenten rose, and it wants a lot of shade too, and it'll take some filtered light, but don't put it where it gets any sun. And here you can see a blossom. This blossom particularly is green. Here's some more over here that they're green. There are cultivars of this that are pink or cream color. So if you want a Lenten rose with a little bit more color, you could pick one of those cultivars. And this will get probably 18 inches tall. And so to me, it's a good landscape plant to have for shade. Here's a plant I planted. Now this is in my backyard, and I planted this gardenia before I knew I wasn't supposed to plant gardenias in Williamson County. And so I just want to use this to show you that you can plant other plants, but you're going to have to baby them or provide the different conditions they want for them to be successful. They're going to take more maintenance, but if you're willing to do that and willing to have the plant, then go for it. And so this plant gets extra care. It doesn't look like it right there, but it really does get extra care. Here's another plant that I like real well. This is in my backyard, and I'm going to move it to the front yard. This is the leopard plant, and some leopard plants on the leaves down here, it has rather large leaves. I would say these leaves are every bit 10 to 12 inches across. They like a lot of shade, and here it's getting some late evening sun, and that's working for it, but don't give it any direct sun, and it needs a lot of shade. I went out one day in September and it had bloomed, and look at the monarchs on it. And so I ran back in and got my camera and took a picture. And so different things that you have, remember, they can be nectar plants for butterflies. If you want to draw butterflies or some bees to your yard, I always like having the pollinators. And speaking of butterflies, here's one of my favorite. This is the swallowtail butterfly, the big yellow and black ones, or I also have the big blue and black ones that come to my yard. Well, their host plant is the Dutchman's pipevine. And so This is a variegated one. There's also one that's not variegated that gets a lot bigger and a lot woodier. So I don't know if that one's a host plant or not. But on this particular pipe vine, I have an area you can see by my back fence, and this is all shaded. Pretty much it gets a little evening sun whenever the sun crosses the horizon before it sets. But this plant does well there, and I have lots of caterpillars. And I went out a while ago and counted about 30 caterpillars on my plant. So they've pretty well decimated my plant, but it will come back. So they just eat the leaves off, and I keep watering it, and it'll grow back, and I'll get all new leaves on it, and I'll get another batch of butterflies, and we go through it again. But then I enjoy seeing the butterflies come to the yard. First of all, I want to say this picture I took from the Central Texas Gardener website. This is the blossom or the bloom on the Dutchman's pipe vine, and I think it's kind of neat, but mine have all been eaten, so I couldn't show you any of mine, so that's why I got this particular picture. But they do bloom like that, and it's a very interesting bloom. And this can be used as a ground cover, and you can plant it and it'll grow. I don't consider it invasive. I do see other starts of it every once in a while, but to me it's not invasive. I just dig it up and put it next to the plant where I have the other plants, and it takes off and grows along with them. So I don't have a problem with it. I wouldn't want to walk on this plant. This plant only gets probably maybe 8 inches tall. So it's not going to be a big bushy plant, but it could be a ground cover. And it likes the shade. I don't have this plant, but I saw it and I wanted to include it. Some people want bigger plants for their yard. Like I don't have big plants in my front yard, but if I had the type of soil that I would need, to me, I'd probably plant this one. It grows 4 foot tall and it spreads 4 foot wide. It's called the oak leaf plant. And there's a whitish lilac flower spike that you can see on the picture that comes up. It's a perennial, blooms in the spring, likes full shade or part shade. So for shade garden people, I think that's a good choice. And here's another picture of it where you can see how big the leaves get. So it does have large leaves, and I think it would make a good plant for our area. It is for our area when I looked up the zones, so that's something you could have. Here's some plants in my yard that I'm working with. Over here on the left, here's another Lenten rose, and I planted it there because I needed to move it from where it was, and I want to find a place to plant it that's where it's going to be what I call happy. And I'll gradually get to that. The plant that's behind it here is a Japanese Aurelia, I believe it's called, or Fatsia japonica, and it likes total shade too, and it gets rather large. One of the problems I have with both of these plants is they want some good soil and some deep soil. I'm working with 2 and 3 inches of soil for the most part, and so I need to find a spot where I can make it where it's going to be deeper for them. These other 2 pots out here in the shade, the landsleaf coreopsis was just getting so big, and I was doing some care for it, so I cut off all of this, and I'm going to just move it somewhere else, but it will have to go where it gets sun. And I just planted them I just put them over there until they get a little bit better root system. Here's one of my little pops of color I was telling you about. I have the Gebera Daisies in different spots, and so I'll go out and then see this one's blooming, or there's one over here blooming. And they don't get enough sun that they're going to make a lot of cut flowers, but I enjoy them when they're in the yard. So here's another one that's out by my front, that's in my health strip now in pots. And so I have the orange and red and yellow lantana out there, so that these particular colors of Gebera daisies work well. And so I've had some trouble with aphids on them, and I've been fighting them, and so it's a little beat up on the leaves, but we're getting it taken care of. Here's a Gebera daisy that was blooming during the winter, so I took this picture because, like I said, do things that make you smile. If you have a plant that you like or something, we need to enjoy our garden. Here's holly ferns, and I've had these holly ferns for quite a while, and this area is on the left side of my door opposite my flax lilies. And so these holly ferns get total shade, so know that. They may get just a little bit of filtered light, but for the most part, they get total shade, and they seem to do well there, and so that makes me happy. Over here on this side is a red columbine, and here is a Milky Way cast iron plant. And I've got another picture that I want to show you that. You look at these cast iron plants, it looks a little scraggly here, but in all benefit to the cast iron plant, this has been in a pot for 3 years up next to the foundation of my house. I've had some health issues and I haven't been able to garden until this spring. And so I finally got them in the ground. And I think once they're in the ground now, they're going to take off, and in a few months, you won't even know they look damaged. I think they'll be fantastic. But they work well for total shade too, and they're a very hardy plant. Remember my pops of color? Well, here's another one. Last year, I did plant some Oxblood Lilies, and this year they bloomed, and I'm so excited. And what I'm more excited about too is you see little starts of new ones coming up. So they're multiplying, and I understand they do multiply readily, so I'm ready for them to spread. These are planted underneath a redbud tree. When I did research on planting the Oxblood lilies, or I think they're also called schoolhouse lilies, it said not to plant them under oak trees. And so I have a redbud, so that's where mine went. And so I'm excited for them to multiply and to grow there. Now the blossoms don't stay long, but while they're there, they give that pop of color. And these are by a walkway that goes out into the backyard. This is purple haze Mexican spiderwort, and I have it on top of my rain barrels, and it's done quite well there. It blooms almost continually. It kind of has the stem structure of a purple heart, and it readily, if like the squirrels will jump in this, and it kind of get frustrated with them, but it breaks off pieces and they'll fall to the ground. If I pick those pieces up and put in some moist soil, it readily sprouts, grows, and here's off growing again. And so it's doing quite well there. You could use this for a ground cover, but also it wouldn't take foot traffic. So be careful if you're going to use it for foot traffic, it's not a good choice. Here's my front yard now. I just took a few days ago, and I want to show you what I've got planted there. This gets, remember, that early morning sun from about 10 to 11 or 10:30 to 11 o'clock of a morning. So here's what I've come up with that I've got in there right now. This is creeping germander, and I've got it going up this way for the walkway. Here is firecracker fern. This is the second year for the firecracker fern, and it's growing, it's blooming. And so I've planted 2 more out here that's not in this picture right now. I have filled in with coleus because they like the shade, and these were growing. And the squirrels dug them up a little bit, and I put them back in. But anyhow, they add some color and some interest, and you can use them for filler plants or the annuals until your plants take over. I do the same thing with vinca. I've got some vincas planted out through here. Some of it still survived, but it adds a pop of color and it fills in until my perennials take over. And I find sometimes I have to mix the annuals with the perennials to get a little bit more filling and pop of color. You see this kind of dead stuff here in the middle? Okay, that's Engelmann's daisy, and a little bit of it's still blooming. And this bloomed really nice for me earlier in the spring and early summer, and now it's kind of died back, and you still see the green down here at the bottom. I didn't trim that off yet because I wanted you to know what would grow there. And so it gets enough sun, it does that. Remember I talked about root flare. If you look over here at my tree, my husband made my sign. Doesn't it look nice? And so on the state of Texas, but look at the root flare around the tree. And so you can see where the tree curves and comes down, and then there's roots there. Well, a couple inches right next to the tree, I don't have anything there. It's just the bare soil. And then coming out from it, then I've started putting the mulch. And from here out to here, this is probably 2.5 feet. It doesn't look like that now, but it really is. And then around the other area, I've got more mulch and stuff. So I've got a wide area around here. Then on the other side, I've got, oh, it's probably, I don't know, 10 feet on the other side that's mulched too, that I'm going to tell you about later. Here I've got irises, and then I've got society garlic. I think society garlic would grow anywhere. Here's the purple lantana, and it's kind of cascaded over the walkway. Now, remember when I told you that this area here, how it just drained down to the ground and water would run off? I've built this up next to the sidewalk with 3 retaining wall blocks, and you can kind of see them here. And so now, because this is built up down here, and I've got plants and different things up toward the house coming out in the mulch, my water doesn't flow off my property. I'm able to keep it once it rains, and I'm excited about that. Over here is red yucca that grows pretty easily for people, especially in the hill country. And I've got exemia over here. And then this area here had a big Jerusalem sage. Now the Jerusalem sage was going quite well, but it got so big and got so woody that I decided it was unsightly where I wanted it in my front yard. So I took it out, and now there's a new little pigeonberry there. So I'm going to see how that particular one grows. So here, coming down in this corner, you see asparagus fern that's hanging from the tree. Remember I told you can use hanging baskets or plants. And over here, you see the bigger one of my staghorn fern that's hanging on the other side of the tree. These are pops of collar again. I saw these growing in people's yard. I'd always had them in the house at Christmas time and all that sort of thing. And so I decided to venture out and put them outside. So I've got these big pots by my front door, and I've got pillars here on both sides of my front door. And I put the red amaryllis in it. And see how it blooms for me? And it blooms more than once a year. And to me, it's just a showstopper. And so take plant, and it does well all year because this green leaves, they stay through the winter, or they've stayed through the winter last year. And so I was real happy with them. You do need some supports whenever the plant comes up and the flower stalk comes up. Before it, of course, blooms and gets big, you need to put I call it little plant ringer on it so that you can support the plant. Here is my holly fern that's in the front. Here's my red Columbine out here. There's a little scraggly piece of hosta, and I think the hosta's been there for a long time, but it needs to be dug up and fixed. But I think one of the problems with the hosta is I don't have the deep, rich soil it needs. It's competing with a bunch of tree roots, and so it's not doing well right now. I've since got all this landscape back here, but here I wanted you to see a hydrangea. Hydrangeas do grow here, and they're beautiful plants, and the oak leaf ones will grow here too. It's just that I don't have the soil for them. So my way to compensate for me is I put them in an insulated pot. And here it will survive the winter. I'll mulch it, and I get blooms on it. I can add the chemicals to make the blooms different colors if I want, but it's growing for me and it's producing, and that makes me happy. Here's my front yard, okay? And I thought about cleaning everything up so you could see it, but I'm a work in progress, and my yard's a work in progress. And so here you can see what I've done to the front sidewalk. Where this just was all grass or scraggly, I decided to make a walkway. And so I put pavers down. Underneath the pavers, I put compost and soil. I did not put any concrete of any kind because the tree roots are running through here, and I wanted to protect my tree roots. And so as the water comes down off the house now, it comes down this, but because there's all those crevices in the rock and the wood, it kind of stops it and it doesn't flow off my property. To the right here, you see the oak tree, and there's a big bur oak out here, but see how the roots come down? I don't have them covered, and I've got mulch around the outside of them a little bit, and I got some mulch up here and through here, but up next to the tree, there is no mulch. I want you to know that. And so be careful with that, because you don't want that to get the mulch up there and for your tree to start decaying in the bark. Here you have a Mexican sedum that does quite well out here underneath the trees, and this soil isn't very deep, and it will grow and spread for you. It won't take foot traffic, but it is a ground cover, and it stays green all year long. Up here, when you get on the other side of the tree, there's a bunch of mulch through there, and then you run into rain lilies. They're white rain lilies, and they're not really blooming that much now, but they do bloom. And then I've got a bunch of Gebera Daisies up through here. I've got Brazos postemon. I may not have said that right, but that grows well for me and blooms in the spring real pretty. I have a Texas star hibiscus up here that gets that hot sun during the day, and it grows to about 2.5 feet for me, and I get blooms periodically throughout the summer. So to me, that works also. Most of that, the rest of that stuff up here is daisies. There is some phlox up here that's trying to grow, but that's what you see. Here's another phlox I've got to plant in there, but I don't have that done. Over here, I've got lilies planted. Here it kind of looks like a mess, but it's what it is. I've got toad lilies growing under there, and I've got lady's mantle. Well, those particular things do well in the spring until about the middle of July and August, and then the heat or what sun does come down there kind of cooks them. And so I took some tomato cages and cut them in half, and then I draped some shade cloth over them. I'm hoping to keep them alive so that they come back in the fall. So that's just what's growing right there, and that's why it looks kind of a mess. Here you see silver ponyfoot. That's a great ground cover. I've got more Mexican petunias. I've got some bulbs planted in there. I planted my spring bulbs out there, the lilies, the Asiatic lilies, and then behind them there is some caladiums and some pots for color. If you keep going out this way in my yard, there's a big area there where I told you it has mulch, and one of the reasons I put mulch out there is because I wanted to have a place that I could water the trees to give them extra moisture, because some of these plants, they don't want a lot of water, but I needed to have some way to do deep watering to my trees. And another thing, I wanted to give a space where my tree roots could grow like they wanted and not be messed with or cut back or interfered with. And so I have a big mulched area out there. I have a bench there, and I have some stepping stones that's out this way that you can't see. I put in a water feature to my yard, and like I said, my hardscape has to be redone, but that's what I've got going there so far. So you can see that. This is my health strip now. And so it starts over here with irises that bloom. Remember the yellow sun and sand iris? That's what these are out here. And so just a little clip on iris. Once an iris comes up and blooms, that particular rhizome does not usually bloom again. And so what happens, it puts out another rhizome or another leaf set will come up, and then that will produce a bloom. So just be aware of that. Here you can see the different things I have going there, and I just got a thing. I've got 1 minute. I need to shut off here. But I do want to tell you that I've made some resources for you. There's a resource on gardening with deer for shade gardening that I have that you can have access to. And then there's 2 more for plants for shade gardening. And they're on the Texas AgriLife website, where the calendar is that talks about today's meeting. So I'm going to stop now and let Kate take over.
Wow, thanks, Jane. That was fantastic. I've got a couple questions for you that have come in from our audience. The first one is, Madison was wondering if there are any edibles that grow in the shade.
I do not know that. I have put out parsley and different things like that in my area that gets, with the Gebera Daisies that get some sun, and it does well out there, okay? And so there's some things like that. It depends on how much sun you get. If you've got total shade, I don't think you're going to grow any edibles.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Jane. The only thing I could think of were some herbs. I've got some mint that's doing better in the shade than it was in the full sun this summer. A few other herbs that can tolerate some shade, but really most of our vegetables are going to need full sun. Maybe some of the greens could do okay in late afternoon sun.
Well, yeah,
Afternoon shade.
if you think about your vegetables, like a lot of them need 6 to 8 hours of sun. And
Mhm.
so anything, the rest of that could be shade. So depend on where you have them.
Yeah. Great. I think that was the main question that we had. We did have one of our master gardeners has also had success with her gardenia, which I'm impressed. Both of you are good gardeners, tenacious. All right. Well, thank you, Jane. That was fantastic. We're getting some really great comments in from everybody. Thank you all for joining us. It was a little bit of a challenge, I know, to get online with our links this evening, but I do appreciate you for joining with us. We'll try to get our technology fixed for next time, and I will have this posted online as soon as we get the video ready and edited so that you can watch the full thing if you didn't get a chance to get all of it. But thank you, Jane, and we hope to see everybody soon.
What was that, okay?